welcome back to Edge of Wild. Today I'm going to take a little bit of time to walk through my planning process for the upcoming gardening year. I take all of my notes from last year, kind of lay everything out, and then build from there. But I wanted to share with you the thoughts that go into building my garden. This is going to be my third year growing a vegetable garden on my own. My parents always grew one when I was growing up, and I'd help some here or there, but wasn't really responsible for making the decisions of what we were going to grow and making sure everything stayed alive. I just helped with weeding mostly. When I sit down and plan out my garden, I look at a couple of different factors, and one of the things that I start with is kind of the location and the size of my space. So I want to locate it somewhere, if I can, that's going to be sunny, because almost all vegetables really need a lot of full sun days to get fruit to grow or to produce the vegetables that they're growing. They have high light requirements. You want to look at your space and kind of say, how much space do I really have to dedicate? If you're somewhere where you don't have a large backyard and you only have a patio, and by chance it happens to be south facing so you get a lot of sun, you can do a lot of stuff in containers. In a bigger space like what I have, I'm able to pick a spot where I have lots of sunshine, and at that point it becomes a lot about how much time I have to dedicate to the garden. You don't want to start out with something so large that you can't keep up with maintaining it, taking care of the weeds, and especially harvesting your produce. There's nothing more disappointing than not being able to get out and get everything harvested and things going to waste. So take all those into consideration when you're building your plan. With that, you can kind of think about, what am I going to grow? Now, this really depends how much space you have as to how much you can grow of everything, but if you really like tomatoes, you should probably dedicate a lot more space to tomatoes, versus if you're not really into lettuces, maybe not putting as much space into greenery. There's a lot of things that you can grow in the brassica family that you can actually use the leaves as greenery for salads or sauteing. So sometimes doubling up on plants like broccoli or cauliflower, being able to use the greens off of those and not dedicating space to lettuces if you're not really into salads makes a lot more sense. For us, we don't like peppers. We have no real desire to like peppers, so we don't grow any peppers. Even though I have a really big space and I could probably fit them in, I don't have any use for them, so I don't grow any. One of the other things you kind of want to consider during the off season is buying some produce that you have never tried before and making a recipe with it. I did this last year with radishes and beets. That way I knew just how much space I wanted to dedicate in the garden to them, because I knew how much either work it was to prepare them, or if I actually had any recipes that I would use them in. So you don't want to plant something that you have no idea if you like or not and give it a huge amount of space, and then it turns out you don't like it because now you've taken that space away from something else that you do really like. Once you've figured out your space, how much time you have to dedicate to everything, and what you want to grow, then it's time to sit down and think about your layout. So your layout depends heavily on what you're growing. Growing spinach takes a lot less space than growing squash, depending on how many plants you want to put in. On the back of every seed packet, they'll give you an estimated time to plant everything, depth, time to harvest, and then your spacing for requirements for all of the crops. So I can sow a lot more spinach plants in an area where I could only sow one squash plant. So those are all things to kind of keep in mind. There are also certain plants that don't necessarily pair well together. One of those examples that I try to keep very far apart are my tomatoes and my cucumbers. Cucumbers, squash, zucchini, all of it's a lot more likely up here to end up with powdery mildew. which can cause a lot more diseases in tomatoes. So I keep them at opposite ends of the garden. Once you've figured out your planting space, how much area you have to plant in, what you really want to plant, then you can take some time to figure out your layout. So some of the tools that really help me out are looking at seed packets. Usually the back of the seed packets has some information. One of my favorite places to order seeds is from Johnny's, and that's because they have so much information on the back of a seed packet, from row spacing to how to transplant, direct seeding, harvest, all of that. And there's a ton of information. So even though they don't have the pretty pictures on the front, the amount of information on the back is worth ordering from them and not necessarily having the pretty envelopes. Their catalog is gorgeous and is also packed with a ton of information as to when stuff can be grown, the flavors of stuff, things like that. So they're one of my favorite places to order from. Another really good place to get information is the Gardener Supply website. If you scroll all the way to the bottom of the Gardener Supply website, there's a section called Advice. From there, you can go into planning tools and then into the Kitchen Garden Planner. I used this last year and it was phenomenal. You're able to lay out an entire garden space, to lay out raised beds or rows, and then put crops in it, see how many crops you can fit in a foot by foot area, and then look and see what crops go really well together. This helped me immensely last year when I was planning out my garden, especially for the first year, so I knew how much size for what I wanted to grow. It just took a lot of the thinking process out, and I was able to understand how many plants I could have per square foot. I'll link a video in the description of Laura over at Garden Answer walking through the website. It was a awesome resource. Even though I use all of those resources for building my garden space, I still love to put pen to paper. So I usually will take the time to draw out my garden, kind of plan everything out as to what I'm going to plant, what I'm going to put where, and just have a drawn visual. It's a little bit of fun for me just because then I get to go through and kind of almost put my plans in action before I'm able to actually do it outside. So I love doing that as well. Once you've figured out all of that information, then you need to start planning out when you're going to start your seeds. Some things such as carrots, beets, radishes don't need to be started indoors, and you're able to direct sow them outside. Things like potatoes you can direct sow in the ground outside, but you need to know when can you do that. Knowing when you can do that comes from knowing your estimated last frost date for the year. The easiest way to find your estimated last frost date is to get on Dr. Google. Simply Google what is the estimated last frost date for whatever the closest town or city is to you. Now it's important that you know your area. Just because the closest town has one date, the town on the other side of you might have a significantly different date. So for me, I live on the Tug Hill Plateau, actually on the very edge of it. Because I'm at a higher elevation than all of the major cities surrounding me, I kind of have to take that into account as well. One city that is close by, the estimated last frost date is May 8th. The other city that is close by is May 20th. Those are two very different dates. Usually for us, we kind of have to go with the later of the two because again, it's usually colder here than either of those cities. And we kind of stick with the theory that we can't put anything frost tender in the ground until May 30th. Even then, depending on the year, you're still at a slight risk of frost damage. Once you have this information that is your estimated last frost date, you know when you can start your seeds by counting back the appropriate number of weeks labeled on the seed packet. So if something says that you have to go back 6 weeks from your last frost date, you know that you can start that 6 weeks prior. Once you have that information and you know what stuff you're going to start, I highly recommend making a book or a journal and keeping track of when you plan to start everything. If not, setting reminders in your phone to know, hey, I need to go start my celery seeds today. Once you know your planting space, what you want to plant, and your estimated last frost date as to when you can start seeds or direct sow anything outside, you need to take a soil sample. Soil samples can be taken into cooperative extensions, even local garden centers. Ask around and see where gardeners in your area have taken soil samples to get results. Soil samples are very important so you know what is lacking in your soil. For me, I took a soil sample late last year because some of my plants were starting to struggle. I figured out from that soil sample that my ground lacked nitrogen. That meant that I had to use a lot of fertilizers in order to bring the nitrogen level up so that plants like my brassicas that depend on nitrogen for the leafy green growth could actually grow, develop, and survive. Once you know what is lacking in your soil, you can take the proper steps to fix it. For me, because I am lacking nitrogen, I was able to take a lot of compost from the goats and the chicken that have been aged and put it on the garden this year to sit there all winter. This will help put some more nitrogen back in my soil. You can also do some research and figure out if there's any plants that you want to grow that can help amend your soil. For me, the nitrogen can be added to the soil by growing peas or beans. Are nitrogen fixing plants because they actually have nodules that grow along their roots that fix nitrogen into the soil. It's very important when growing these things not to pull the roots out of the soil once the plant is done producing. Cut everything off at soil level and let it break down naturally. With all this information, I encourage you to do some research and figure out just what you want to put in your garden for the coming season. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit the like button and subscribe to see more about gardening, the goats, and the chickens.